Hello everyone. The title of today's episode is titled, Are We the Imagination of God? And so Mr. Within wants to speak about a very interesting topic, which he's also working on writing a book on. You see, my friends, it was very interesting. There was a time where I became hypersensitive to the origination of thought in my experience. And I began to see that I can imagine a character living in a world that is boundless. I can imagine abundance, I can imagine clarity, I can imagine enlightenment, I can imagine truth, I can imagine salvation. And then I thought about this character, and I thought about if that character in my mind, which I have visualized to be in such a case, can ever wonder and know who I am that is envisioning it. And so I suddenly got this very interesting and beautiful, serene view that everything in existence is the imagination of God if you're inclined towards a religious perspective. You see, in the Muslim world, people use the word God willing a lot. In the Christian religion, they also look towards God and the miracles of God. So we must recognize that anything in existence is an expression of universal intelligence. And when Mr. Within says we are the imagination of God, he is saying that we are the expression of universal intelligence to itself. But to be able to know the true source of our origin, we will dive so deeply that we will cease to exist in the way that we questioned before. And so that is the path of the truth seeker in regards to any spiritual or mystical context. The word mysticism, many people interpret it in many ways. For some people it is hocus pocus. For others, it is the depth of self-inquiry where a living being in a world where things begin and end and change is asking itself, why this? And is coming to a point where it is realizing and tapping into the unknown. The truth seeker has a question that it wants answered. Many truth seekers want to get enlightened, I was talking to this girl in Iran. She was one of those people who she would move in her dreams, like she could do that evidently, And I was like, sure, let's consider this, She was very cute, so I was like, okay. And so there is, of course, the possibility of us being conscious more than in this reality. But anyways, she would move in her dreams and whatnot. And I asked her this one question, and I was in a very interesting phase of my own, let's say in quotation, spiritual progression. And I asked her, what do you want from spirituality? And spirituality in Farsi, in the Persian language, is irfan. So I asked her, برای چی داری میری دنبال عرفان? And so I asked her, why are you going towards this spirituality? And she told me that she finds that the purpose of it is power. She wants power. And I had a totally different interpretation, and I was not inspired by her answer. I was, in some sense, I became hopeless in that moment. I remember it well. We were at this restaurant, and she asked me the question. And I was going in a very interesting phase, where I felt I was, and, of course, guys, take my words very playfully, but at the time, it was very intense in my mind. I told her I feel I'm a slave to truth, to universal intelligence, to God. In the sense that I told her I feel I am behind a door, and ever since I was a kid, since 7 years old, I was in my bed at night, I remember that I was afraid of the dark, and my mother had told me, I went up to her and I was like, Mom, I'm afraid of the dark. I had seen that movie that Mel Gibson's in called Signs, this alien movie. So I was afraid of the dark and whatnot, as a young kid. And so she told me, of course, I was raised in a religious environment, semi-religious, semi-spiritual, and she told me say the names of God, in Islam. She told me say 7 times Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, which means in the name of the God that is benevolent and merciful. So every night I would say this 7 times before I could go to sleep when I would fear things. And everywhere I would go, I would just say this 7 times, And so at that age, it was very, it was helpful. But it was one of those things that I would get a side experience, not just something that would, in some sense, diminish my fear of my own imagination. But it was one of those things where I would feel every time I would say it, it was as if I was knocking on the door of truth 7 times, and I was always behind this door. And so when she asked me, it was very interesting because I was in a similar vibe, and I told her, I feel as if I am behind the door of truth. And the door doesn't open from me. It doesn't open by the hand of my ego or identity. And so it was very interesting. I remember saying something like that. And I think it kind of turned her off, actually. Pretty much what I'm trying to get to is that, dear listeners, the person that is speaking now, the presence of existence that is here now, that is being voiced through me, it does not believe that the point of spirituality is the advancement of power. It is an intelligence that is considering that the body is finite and the mind is infinite. The body is here to end, and the mind is always beginning to itself in parallel realities, in infinite parallel realities. And so the conclusion of the observer, if one can say that the body and mind are observed, is beyond infinity and the finite. And it takes the person to a point of pure being, where in that state of pure being, you realize the void of language. You realize the source of language is how existence is the presence of nothing. How everything, including the planets, stars, and everything we know, is dangling in emptiness. In that emptiness, one goes to a state where they see that just like how if you thought a character, that character analogy, I said imagining a character, that character in your imagination realizes that there is you who is imagining it. It does not know you. It looks around and sees some people in this imaginary world are worshipping this God. They have identified it. They have shaped it. Some people are denying it. But there is imagination that is being reality for that character in your imagination that is wondering who you are, the person imagining it, the presence imagining it. And so the conclusion that is left is that one realizes, and the benevolence of Christ understood this as well, the wisdom of Christ, where in the Bible there's a quote where it says, to be in the world but not of it. And there is such wisdom in that, in the sense that the character in that imagination of God, in the imagination of that person imagining the character, begins to see that it is in a world, but it is not of the world, in the sense that what is imagining is always there. What that means is your thoughts are not separate from you, and in some sense, very playfully, you are the God of the thoughts in your mind. But when you realize you too are a thought, then you recognize that the source of it is not from an idea. And when it is not an idea, you have come to the absolute presence. You come to the solution of all that is, which is the present moment, unspeakably, undeniably, here and now. These precious words that have come to us from many great sages, as saints and sages. I want you, dear listener, to try something out for me. I want you to, for a moment, just try to consider what I'm saying and follow through with it to see where it leads. what I want to say is this. Right now, as I'm speaking, I am looking at something. I'm looking at my laptop and this microphone in front of me. And as I'm seeing this, I realize that if I close my eyes, I can have the imagination of it there, the thought of it, the visualization, the memory, whatever you like to call it. And so if my eyes are closed and I'm seeing a thought, I'm seeing an imagination or something, I'm seeing the microphone while my eyes are closed. Now, this is the interesting thing. When my eyes are closed, there isn't the sensory perception of light. There is no light. So what is, while my eyes are closed, aware and seeing that thought in my mind? And you come to the point where you ask, is a thought seeing a thought? And you see that does not make sense. So you realize the observer within, and the observer within realizes that that which is being observed is a quality of that which it is not being what it's seeing. What that means, my dear friends, is that if we are the imagination of God, the imagination of universal intelligence, we are, at our core, the universe being intelligent, which renders one inseparable from existence. And so we have seen in many ancient texts, and also how Swami Krishnananda very beautifully has said, he says, meditation stops when one realizes the inseparability of the individual activity with the cosmic activity, the inseparability of the quality of existence with the actual source of its emanation. We have Hafiz, the Sufi mystic poet from 700 years ago, say something very beautiful in his poetry. He says, the sun's light creates infinite shadows during the day when it hits all the different objects that are on the surface of our planet. But the shadows are not the light. And if one was to see that the light is a shadow for a greater truth, we find ourselves at a point where for our body we see, okay, things end. For our mind, we come to a point of infinite regression where we see there is no end, and that is an end in itself. So the search stops in the context of temporalness and in the context of eternity, and you open your eyes as the presence of everything through nothing, and you realize that you have been playing around with the idea of a soul that you thought was eternal in a temporal body. You laugh at every idea you have had, and you come to that moment where the supremacy of what is being is unspeakably what it is. And so, dear listeners, you are what you are. Everything is what it is. And so, in the silence of a wise heart, the tears that roll down on the face of a child that looks itself in a mirror and sees an end will see that even the beginning is there, but neither are there if there is a greater witness. You have a task in this world, and that task is to comprehend this movement, to comprehend the silence where this movement is occurring, and to comprehend that which is. The voices come and go, the leaves on the tree change, and they never see the roots, but the roots are there. In ancient alchemy, they have considered a very interesting idea, that our roots, the roots of the being, is in earth, but its branches are in the heavens. Dear listener, if you are beyond your ideas, how can your ideas define you? If you are beyond thought, how could thought conclude you? If logic is in the domain of thought and there is something beyond thought, how could we have a logical answer to consciousness? And as Henry David Thoreau, this wonderful poet, beautifully says, things do not change, we change. I hope this talk has served you. Much blessings and namaste.